Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay. Time for the fifth installment of my WrestleMania series, my countdown and review of each and every WrestleMania up until WrestleMania 41 on April the 20th. So this is WrestleMania 5. The Mega Powers exploding. It's kind of a continuation of last year's WrestleMania in the sense that it's in the same venue. It's in Trump Plaza, which is the in Atlantic City. It's called Trump Plaza. It's really the Atlantic City Recreation Center, but it's called Trump Plaza for these two events. Donald Trump is your host, and it's also a continuation because the storyline is a continuation. Where we left off yesterday at WrestleMania 4, Hulk Hogan uh, helped Macho Man Randy Savage win the WWF Championship after it was held up in a tournament. Macho Man defeats Ted DiBiase in the finals, and he's now the champion. And like I said before that, Macho Man and Hulk Hogan have formed a tag team called the Mega Powers. And throughout 1988, Macho Man and Hogan were teaming together. They teamed together at the first SummerSlam against Andre the Giant and the Million Dollar Man Ted DiBiase. They teamed to get together at the Survivor Series in 1988, and they were the sole survivors. And they were managed by the lovely Miss Elizabeth. And everything seemed cool up until uh, the beginning of 1989. There were little hints, even when they won the match at SummerSlam, after they were celebrating, they're doing their in ring celebration. Hulk Hogan puts his hand slightly on Miss Elizabeth's ass because Miss Elizabeth was dressed very provocatively, at least for 1988 WWE. She had a short, tight dress and she distracted Ted DiBiase, and that's how they were able to get the win. So this was done on purpose because WWE wanted to hint at Hulk Hogan, kind of hitting on Miss Elizabeth. And then uh, they started to have their feud with the Big Boss Man and Akeem. Remember, I said George Gray, the one man gang, in 1988 would switch his gimmick up. Originally, he was the one man gang, which is what he was in Mid South, and what he was in World Class Championship Wrestling. He was initially in the WWE, but now Vince McMahon has a new idea for him. His manager Slick comes out and says, "I'm introducing a new wrestler from the deepest, darkest jungles of Africa, the African Dream, the big man Akeem." And it's George Gray dressed up as in an Afrocentric outfit with a dashiki on and with a kufi, doing his little jive dance. It's meant to mock Dusty Rhodes because at this time Dusty Rhodes is he's the booker for Jim Crockett. He is the brains behind Starcade, the brains behind the Great American Bash, the brains behind War Games. He is the engine that is pushing Jim Crockett Promotions, to be WWE's number one competition. So Vince does this to mock him. George Gray, a big fat white guy that acts black. Dusty Rhodes, a big fat white guy that acts black as well. But Akeem is over the top, and he's teaming with the Big Boss Man. Now, who is the Big Boss Man? The Big Boss Man is Ray Traylor. Ray Traylor initially comes into wrestling in 1985 as a jobber on Jim Crockett TV. He's a former um, corrections officer in Cobb County in Georgia. So to supplement that income, much like we talked about with George the Animal Steel in regards to his teaching, well, Ray Traylor is the same way. Ray Traylor uh, wants to supplement his income of being a correction officer, so he becomes a professional wrestler. Initially, he's a jobber on TV, and he's doing a match with Tully Blanchard, and Dusty Rhodes sees him and says, "Wait a minute, this guy is too big to be a jobber." So they train him a little bit, and then they hook him up with a gimmick. His gimmick is Big Bubba Rogers. and he is the manager of he is the bodyguard rather of manager Jim Cornette, because Jim Cornette is having the feud with the Road Warriors. Jim Cornette and the Midnight Express are having the feud with the Road Warriors. You guys remember Starrcade '86, the scaffold match. So the storyline is Jim Cornette's mama has hired Big Bubba Rogers to be his bodyguard, and Ray Traylor's doing that um, for a while, doing that gig, and he's shooting with Dusty Rhodes. He has a cage match with Dusty Rhodes. When the buyout happens, uh, they send him down to the Jim Crockett Promotions version of UWF, and he wins the title, oddly enough, from the One Man Gang in 1987. But he wants to move on to greener pastures. He gets an offer from Vince McMahon to make the jump to the WWF, and he does. And they find out that he was a former correction officer, so they make him a heel cop on TV, and he is as part of the Twin Towers. He and Akeem. They're managed by Slick, and they start to feud with the Mega Powers. And on one episode of Saturday Night's Main Event, Big Boss Man goes to attack Elizabeth. He grabs her by the wrist, and Macho Man comes out, and they're beating down Hulk Hogan. And Hulk Hogan is Miss Elizabeth starting to come out in Hulk Hogan's corner as well, even when Savage isn't there. Even when it's not a tag match, he comes out in her corner anyway. So Savage comes to make the save, not for Hogan, but he comes to save Elizabeth. Then later on he's having a match with the Bossman and Akeem, and Hogan doesn't come to save him. So obviously there's tension in the ranks. Not only is Hogan doing suspicious things with Miss Elizabeth in their post-match celebrations, like almost touching her ass, he's also not caring about the Macho Man nearly at all. So it comes to a head at the and then there's the Royal Rumble. The Royal Rumble 1989, the first pay-per-view version of the Royal Rumble, won by Big John Studd. We'll be talking about him later because he was featured in WrestleMania 5 as well. During that, Hulk Hogan goes to eliminate Bad News Brown and accidentally eliminates the Macho Man Randy Savage. Now, for those that are wondering, yes, Randy Savage was the WWF champion, and yes, the WWF champion was allowed to be in the Royal Rumble because the stipulation hadn't existed yet that the winner of the Royal Rumble becomes the number one contender to the world champion. That doesn't exist until 1993. So Randy Savage in '89 was in the Royal Rumble when he gets eliminated by Hogan, and him and Hogan come face to face. Now there's more dissension in the ranks. Then on another episode of Saturday Night's Main Event, they're having a match with the Twin Towers, a tag team match. And Miss Elizabeth gets knocked off the apron. Now Hogan leaves Randy Savage out to pasture, and he goes to take Elizabeth to the back. He's carrying her. And of course, Savage is pissed. He ends up winning the match, but he's still pissed off that Hogan did this. So then he goes to the back, the medical facilities, they're tending to Elizabeth. He's arguing with Hogan. They're shoving each other. Beefcake comes out to try to separate the two. And finally, Hogan turns around. Elizabeth is screaming, "Randy, stop! Randy, stop!" Hogan turns around, and Randy Savage just clocks him with the belt. And he's beating the shit out of him on Saturday Night's Main Event. Finally, this is Savage's heel turn, and Hogan challenges him to a match at WrestleMania 5. So the Mega Powers have exploded. Randy Savage, in a fit of jealousy, he says, "Hogan, you had lust in your eyes for Elizabeth. I saw you out there grandstanding and hot dogging. I didn't need your help to take on Bossman and Akeem. I was good all by myself. But you, Hulk Hogan, you had to get into the business. And you had to stick your nose in. And you said that you had lust in your eyes for Elizabeth." Basically Hogan, the plot of it was that Hogan was plotting to take his best friend's girl. And kind of he was. But Elizabeth, she's torn in two directions. She doesn't know who to pick. So she is in a neutral corner. She declares that she will be in a neutral corner come the pay-per-view. And That's basically the main event. Now, other matches, other big programs is the Ultimate Warrior. We talked about the Ultimate Warrior last WrestleMania 4. He debuted in '87, and he had his first big show at WrestleMania 4 against Hercules Hernandez, and he defeated him. Now, in 1988, the first SummerSlam, the Honky Tonk Man is supposed to take on Brutus the Barber Beefcake. Beefcake gets injured, so Beefcake needs a replacement. So he says, "I'll take on anybody." And the Warrior comes out, makes quick work of Honky, and ending Honky's months-long title reign, the longest title reign for the Intercontinental Championship up to that date. So going into WrestleMania 5, the Ultimate Warrior is the Intercontinental Champion. Also going into WrestleMania 5, uh, Brutus Beefcake, on a roll, being the barber now, has a match with the Million Dollar Man, Ted DiBiase. As I said, the Million Dollar Man, Ted DiBiase, has really fallen from grace. He was in the main event last year, but this year he's just in a go nowhere non-title match, not non-title because he doesn't put the $1 million belt up against um, Beefcake here. So some of the other big matches on this show, um, Demolition, like I said, they're a babyface tag team. They're taking on the Powers of Pain and teaming with Mr. Fuji in a handicap match. Fuji, who was a great wrestler in the 1970s, is finally coming back uh, to in-ring action at this pay-per-view. Remember I said Survivor Series, he did the double turn and he turned on Demolition. And um, now Demolition are baby faces and the Powers of Pain are heels. So that's another tag team match on this show is Strike Force, uh, the former tag team champions, Tito Santana and Rick Martel taking on the Brainbusters, Arn Anderson and Tully Blanchard. Also, the Rougeau brothers, who have recently turned heel, taking on the Bushwhackers. The Bushwhackers, their story in the WWF is really funny. Um, when they were in Jim Crockett Promotions, as well as in territories like Puerto Rico and New Zealand, they were the sheep herders, and they were a brutal and vicious tag team. But now they've come to the WWF, and Vince McMahon really neutralized them. A lot of fans talk about how they were ruined when they came to the WWF because they were put with this ultra cartoony gimmick. The Twin Towers are also in action. Uh, they're going to be taking on the Rockers. This is the first time we're seeing Shawn Michaels. A lot of new faces at this WrestleMania because three we're going to talk about that are new faces that will be regulars in our other WrestleMania talks. But we got to start with this one. We gotta really talk about this guy, and this is Shawn Michaels, because Shawn Michaels will go on to be Mr. WrestleMania. He will be going to be crowned Mr. WrestleMania, and this is his first WrestleMania. The Twin Towers versus the Rockers. Now, who are the Rockers? The Rockers are Marty Jannetty and, of course, Shawn Michaels. Now, initially, they were formed in the AWA. Shawn Michaels broke into the business in Mid-South Wrestling, but he was just basically a jobber in Mid-South. From there, he moves on to the AWA. He was trained by Jose Lothario because he's from San Antonio. So the wrestling that he grew up watching was Southwest Championship Wrestling. Tully Blanchard's father Joe's territory, which was the original territory on the USA Network before the early '80s, before the WWF. The original wrestling on the USA Network was Southwest Championship Wrestling, Joe Blanchard's territory. So Shawn Michaels grew up a fan of that, but he didn't really. He was trained by superstar Jose Lothario, but he didn't break in on there. He broke in Bill Watts' territory, kind of a jobber in Bill Watts' territory. Like I said, from there moving on to Bob Geigel's territory, the Central States territory, based out of Kansas City. That's where he first met Scott Hall. And then after that, going on to the AWA with Vern Gagne. And him and Marty got to know each other in Central States too. Marty was kind of a big deal in Central States. But the Midnight Express and the Rock and Roll Express are blowing up all over the wrestling world. You know, they started off in Memphis, then they moved down to Mid South. Then from Mid South, they're now national promotion in Jim Crockett. So Vern Gagne wants to counteract that. So he comes up with the idea of combining both names. Instead of the Rock and Roll Express and the Midnight Express, the Midnight Rockers. And then initially, Vern says, "Wait a minute, don't you think that the fans will think that it's, you know, you're talking about rocking chairs? You sure they won't get it confused with rocking chairs?" And Shawn Michaels and Marty Jannetty look at Vern like, "Come on, really? Rocking chairs, Vern Gagne? Are you serious?" But they become a huge success in the AWA. Particularly in 1986, they have a great match at the Showboat where Sherry is managing Buddy Rose and Doug Summers. Remember we talked about Buddy Rose at the WrestleMania 1 episode, in a real bloodbath against the Midnight Rockers. But they move on. In '89, they give Vince McMahon's attention, and they initially come in. They have a huge blow up with Jesse Barr, a bar fight, and they get fired. The funny story behind that is they were scared that they were going to get fired because of the bar fight. So they have Shawn Michaels had on cowboy boots, and Vince McMahon passes them in the hallway, and he goes, "Nice boots, gentlemen. Don't you know they were made for walking?" So they're fired, and they go back down to Memphis. And that's during their time in Memphis, they actually have a feud with the Rock and Roll, because the Rock and Roll's not in Jim Crockett anymore. They're working in Memphis in the late '80s. But pretty soon, Vince brings them back, and this is their first WrestleMania match. And this becomes one of 3 WrestleMania matches that we'll be seeing them in. They wrestle here, WrestleMania 5, WrestleMania 6 against the Orient Express, and WrestleMania 7 against the Barbarian and Haku. The other debuts on this show are Mr. Perfect and Owen Hart, aka the Blue Blazer. Mr. Perfect is, of course, a second generation wrestler, Kurt Hennig, the son of Larry the Axe Hennig, a big star in Minnesota, probably the second biggest, or the third biggest star, probably behind Vern Gagne himself. And Nick Bockwinkel, at least in the later days of the AWA. So of course Kurt breaks in there, and he and Scott Hall are a tag team for a while, but he goes on to singles action, and in 1988 he actually becomes the AWA champion by defeating Nick Bockwinkel. But he is so good that once again, just like just like Hulk Hogan, just like the initial raid in '84, Vince McMahon is, and the Midnight Rockers too. Vince McMahon is looking for Vern's other talent. That's why Vern can never build him up fast enough, because Crockett or McMahon will want to steal him and put him on a national stage. Even though Vern has a national TV deal with ESPN, It's not as good as the one that Crockett has with TBS or Vince has with his cable affiliates. So Kurt Hennig and Jerry Lawler have a knockdown drag-out match that the previous year in 1988, where Kurt drops the belt to him and he's headed to the WWF. And the gimmick they come up with him in the WWF is not trading on his name, being a second-generation star, but as Mr. Perfect. Basically, he's good at every sport. The vignettes, they show him playing golf, they show him swimming, they show him throwing a football, they show him shooting a basketball, and he's just perfect at everything. And his slogan is, "I'm absolutely perfect." Initially, he's managed by the Genius, Laney Poffo, Randy Savage's brother. But later on, he'll go on to be managed by Bobby the Brain Heenan and be part of the Heenan family. But here, he's wrestling Owen Hart. He's wrestling as the Blue Blazer. Now, Owen Hart was part of his father's promotion. After 1980, 86, when Stu Hart took the buyout, he was supposed to not promote any other wrestling in the Calgary area and the territories that he covered in Western Canada. Well, his son Bruce didn't get the memo because Bruce started up promoting wrestling again for the students in his school. And this class in the late 80s included the likes of Brian Pillman, the likes of Chris Benoit, and the likes of Owen Hart. But Owen Hart was the real star and the real standout. So Vince McMahon was interested in him. But again, just like with Kurt Hennig, he didn't want to trade him in on his wrestling name, being Stu Hart's son or being Bret Hart's brother. So he puts him underneath the mask of a superhero, the Blue Blazer. It's really a lame gimmick, and it sucked. But the match with him was, pretty good. Mr. Perfect defeats him. Jake the Snake Roberts, what's he up to? Well, he's having a match with Andre the Giant. Once again, like Ted DiBiase, Andre the Giant is he fell from grace. Now he's having the feud with Jake Roberts, and Jake would bring out the snake, and Andre would act like he was deathly afraid of the snake. I heard he really was afraid of snakes. But the person that's coming back into the Andre story is Big John Studd. Big John Studd had left the promotion around late 86, but now he's back, and he won the second Royal Rumble, like I said, and he's a babyface. So basically, him and Andre have switched roles now. WrestleMania 1, he was the heel, and Andre was the babyface. Now, Andre is the heel, and he's the babyface. So he's the referee for this match between Jake the Snake Roberts and Andre. Jim Duggan and Bad News Brown go to a double disqualification. I forgot to talk about Bad News Brown in the WrestleMania 4 episode. He won a battle royal, and then him and Bret Hart were the sole two. And him and Bret Hart have a history because Bad News Brown / Bad News Allen was an alum from the Calgary territory. And he actually, and that confrontation with Bret Hart at the end of that battle royal was what actually turned Bret Hart and the Hart Foundation face. The Red Rooster here is taking on the Brooklyn Brawler. The story behind the Red Rooster, Terry Taylor, of course, a big star in the Mid-South territory, like one of the premier stars in the Mid-South territory, especially towards the latter years. But unlike other Mid-South alum, he doesn't go directly to WCW. He chose to go to the WWE. He comes into the WWE, and they don't really see much in him the way that Watts did, and they put him with a Red Rooster. They give him the gimmick of a rooster. Now, supposedly, him and Hennig come in the same year, and supposedly he was supposed to get the Mr. Perfect character, and Hennig was supposed to get the Red Rooster character. But he gets the Red Rooster because Vince thought he was very conceited. So the cock of the walk, basically. and his manager is Bobby Heenan. But the plan is to turn him face. He's not going to listen to Heenan. He's going to eventually turn on Heenan, and Heenan will bring in the Brooklyn Brawler to neutralize him. So that's who he's taking on here at WrestleMania 5 is the Brooklyn Brawler. The results of the three tag team, there's 3 championship matches. Okay. The results of the 3 championship matches. The Brainbusters defeat Strikeforce. Strikeforce, well, not Strikeforce. Rick Martel turns heel. Tito Santana goes to tag him, and he drops out. He doesn't give Tito the tag. He's tired of Tito, and now Rick has turned heel. This will eventually lead to Rick Martel getting the model gimmick and going on. We'll see in the next installment at WrestleMania 6, he will open up the show as Rick the Model Martel. This is his heel turn. And I think it was a really brilliantly done heel turn. One thing about this, though, was that they don't continue the storyline all that much. There's really no payoff between Tito Santana and Rick Martel. So anyway, that's the end of this tag team. The Intercontinental match, Rick Rude wins. He defeats the Ultimate Warrior. And I'll never forget this match because, well, Ultimate Warrior has some ugly-ass boots, number 1. And number 2 is the way Rick Rude won. Warrior goes to Gorilla Press Slam Rude, right? And then Bobby Heenan grabs Warrior's leg and holds Warrior's leg down for the pin. Now, I don't think we really discussed Rick Rude's origins because it's the first time he's really appearing on this list. In the WrestleMania review video. Rick Rude comes to the promotions. He came in late '87. Him and the Raging Bull Manny Fernandez were a tag team. Before that, he had been in World Class Championship Wrestling, where he was managed by Percy Pringle, and he was the champion of World Class. He was the World Class champion for a while, the WCCWA champion for a while, and that's when he had a feud with Hellwig. So him and the Ultimate Warrior have a tremendous chemistry. So they have a pretty good match here. This would lead down the road to several Weasel Suit matches. Bobby Heenan would bring back the Weasel Suit stipulation that he used to have in the AWA and the matches he had with Greg Gagne. But Rude's gimmick is crazy because he would come out and he would berate the fans. He'd be like, "What I'd like to have right now is for all you fat, out of shape." And then whatever city they were in, he would do the Rude Awakening where he would pick a woman out from the crowd and kiss and make out with her. And he eventually does that to Cheryl Roberts, which leads to the feud with him and Jake the Snake Roberts in the latter part of '88. So he's another introduction, another Minnesota boy. You have so many Minnesota boys in professional wrestling, especially in WWE. You have Barry Darsow. But you have two debuting here, Mr. Perfect and Rick Rude. So Rick Rude is your new Intercontinental Champion, defeating the Ultimate Warrior. Now, Ultimate Warrior would get the belt back from Rude later at SummerSlam, and he would go on to have it. He'll have it next installment. But what happens in the main event? The World Heavyweight title, the WWF Championship, changes hands once again. Hulk Hogan is the champion, defeating Macho Man with a leg drop. And this is an awesome match. During this time, the Macho Man Randy Savage and Hulk Hogan have tremendous chemistry. Tremendous chemistry. And it shocked me that WWE, for WrestleMania anyway, never went back to the well with this. You know, after this is over, Macho Man will acquire the services of Sensational Queen Sherry, which we'll talk about Sherry in a little bit. And she'll become his manager. But, and you know, they have a couple of matches because Elizabeth eventually becomes the manager of Hulk Hogan, but never matches, never another one-on-one match again on the grandest stage of them all. And I'm very surprised by that. I know that back in the day, Vince McMahon never liked to do rematches, because he never revisited the Hulk Hogan and the Ultimate Warrior, which is the next main event at WrestleMania 6 either. He never revisited any of his WrestleMania main events except Hogan and Andre. Later on, he would do that because, look how many times when we get to the later WrestleManias, particularly in the 30s, you'll see a lot of Roman Reigns versus Brock Lesnar. Roman Reigns versus Brock Lesnar fought each other 3 times at WrestleMania 31, WrestleMania 34, and WrestleMania 35. WrestleMania 31, 34, and 38. But in them days, in the early days, they never did rematches, and I'm very surprised. WCW would go to the well with Hulk Hogan and Randy Savage, but WWE would never go to the well again for big events with Hogan and Randy Savage. And I'm very surprised, like I said, because they had tremendous chemistry. Jesse Ventura is on fire. Like I said, he wasn't really in his groove in WrestleMania 1, 2, and a little bit in 3. One of the jokes in 3 that was cool that he did against Gorilla Monsoon, he says, yeah, Gorilla Monsoon, I remember they were talking about some hold, right? And Gorilla Monsoon says, I remember that. He says, when were you in the ring, Gorilla? In the Hoover days? Insinuating that Gorilla Monsoon wrestled in the 1930s when Herbert Hoover was president before 1933, when Hoover got out of office when FDR was elected, right? In the Hoover days, Monsoon, right? Leave it to Jesse to always interject politics in some way. You go back and you look at Jesse's old commentary, even some of the stuff he did in WCW, he was always giving political commentary. I'll give you another example. Starrcade 93. This is way off topic, but Starrcade 93, they're doing a vignette where Ric Flair is, this is supposed to be if Ric Flair loses this match against Vader, this will be the end of Ric Flair's career. The 10th anniversary of Starrcade, right? Ric Flair, 1983, Harley Race versus Ric Flair. Now Harley Race has come back as a manager. He's managing Vader. And he's put his career on the line against Vader's title. So his family is scared. They show him hugging Reed. They show him hugging David Flair, and they show him hugging Charlotte and leaving his house that night, which means Gene Okerlund. So Okerlund and him are in the limo. They're pulling up to the arena in North Carolina, right? Charlotte, I think this was. And we hear Tony Schiavone and Jesse Ventura on commentary, and Jesse Ventura goes, he has more money than he has more money than Bill Clinton. He said, I don't even think Bill Clinton gets this kind of detail. And of course, in 93, Bill Clinton was the president of the United States. So somehow Jesse Ventura was predicting that he would somehow be involved in politics in some sort of way in the future. And of course, in 1998, he becomes the governor of Minnesota. So Jesse always interjected politics. But as far as the main event match, here, Jesse was in rare form. Throughout the whole Mega Powers feud, Jesse was calling Hulk Hogan the luster Monsoon. Hulk Hogan lusted after Elizabeth, really instigating the feud because he was there when they first kicked it off, when Hogan touched initially Miss Elizabeth's ass. because Jesse Ventura was the referee for the Mega Bucks versus Mega Powers match at SummerSlam '88. So he was instigating it throughout the whole thing, and him and Gorilla are finally getting into their groove as far as the WrestleManias. But it's sad because he's getting into the groove with Gorilla, like in the latter half of the WrestleManias, but he'd be gone at the end of '90. You know, he eventually leaves and he becomes mayor of Brooklyn Park, Minnesota, and then in '92 he shows up in WCW. So just as he's really getting into it, people talk about him and Vince always had more chemistry, I feel like, than him and Gorilla. Gorilla is really with Bobby, but Bobby doesn't come into commentary until after he retires as a manager in '91. And of course, we'll talk about his first time commentating. Well, he commentated for one match at WrestleMania 3, but I didn't really talk about it. But his first time being a full-time commentator is WrestleMania 7, and we're getting there. But this match between Macho Man and Hulk Hogan is tremendous. And this was the first real all pay-per-view one. Like, you couldn't get this on closed circuit. Closed circuit was now dead. Think about this. Closed circuit, the first closed circuit sporting event ever in the history of closed circuit. Like I said, it was boxing. It was Joe Louis. It was a Joe Louis fight. I think it was Joe Louis and Joe Walcott in Jersey. Joe Walcott versus Joe Louis in 1948. That was the first closed circuit sporting event. And then you had when Floyd Patterson beat Ignar Johansson. You had it on closed circuit. When Cassius Clay and aka Muhammad Ali beat Sonny Liston, you had it on closed circuit. The Thriller in Manila, closed circuit. The Rumble in the Jungle between Ali and Foreman, closed circuit. So, and of course, the wrestling events on closed circuit. So, closed circuit had been a thing in sports ever since the 1940s. But now it's no more. Pay-per-view has come into vogue. Mike Tyson is on top of his game in the late '80s in boxing and in wrestling. Like I said, this is the first time ever on full pay-per-view, no closed circuit available. And it becomes the highest selling pay-per-view in the history of the WWF it holds the record for most buys until 1999 when it's finally broken. So Randy Savage and Hulk Hogan was big games. Now we said we talk about Sherry. Sherry comes in also from the AWA. She had done some managing, but she had a tremendous feud with Medusa in the AWA in the late '80s. She comes in to work with Rockin' Robin, who's Jake Roberts' half sister, daughter of Grizzly Smith. And Rockin' Robin is the women's champion. Now, just as she's coming in, Sherry, Vince is deciding to get rid of the women's division, which he inevitably does. Rockin' Robin, she was a decent wrestler, but she was a horrible singer. Remember I said every year they had different people doing the America the Beautiful? Well, '87, of course, you had the Queen of Soul, Aretha Franklin. That was tremendous. WrestleMania 2, we talked about him. Ray Charles, that was tremendous. But at WrestleMania 5, it was Rockin' Robin, and It was terrible, guys. It was the worst fucking atrocious performance of America the Beautiful that there ever was. Last year at WrestleMania 40, it was Coco Jones. And she did America the Beautiful. Speaking of musical interludes, funny musical interlude that they do at WrestleMania, at this WrestleMania, is Run DMC. Run DMC comes out and does a performance like during intermission. So don't ever say that the Super Bowl in 2022 was the first time ever that rap had been featured in a major sporting event, because Super Bowl might have started doing it in 2022, but wrestling, once again, ahead of the curve. WWE is ahead of the curve with the NFL because they started doing it in 1989. Now, of course, much like the Super Bowl, like we talk about with Kendrick, I said that it's the first time ever that a current performer has performed at a major sporting event. Well, Run DMC was not current in 1989. They were well past their prime. Their prime was like 84, 85, but it gets no reaction from these fans in Atlantic City. It completely bombed, but they tried to do something. They would do it later on too at WrestleMania 25, WrestleMania 33. We'll talk about with Pitbull and other ones like 98 with the DX Band. We'll continuously talk about these various musical performances that they tried to do even last year with Lil Wayne, but it never goes over well. So that's pretty much it. Most of these there's a lot of matches on this show, guys. There is 14 matches on this show, and a lot of it is filler. The Hart Foundation defeating Rhythm and Blues, which is Greg Valentine and Honky Tonk Man, now forming a tag team. They'll play an important role, speaking of musical interludes, when it comes to next WrestleMania, WrestleMania 6. Hercules and Haku. Hercules is a babyface now, and he's taking on Haku, who has defeated he's defeated King Harley Race. Harley Race is now headed back to the NWA, which is now called WCW, and he's going to serve in a more managerial role. Pretty soon, Haku will lose the King of the Ring to Hacksaw Jim Duggan, and Hacksaw Jim Duggan will lose the King of the Ring to the Macho Man Randy Savage, and Randy Savage will get a new gimmick as the Macho King. Now, Sherry is no longer a wrestler because the women's division is retired. Sherry is now hooking up with the Macho King, and she will be his manager at WrestleMania. She will be his manager for all throughout 1989 and 1990, going into 1991. But who will they take on at the next WrestleMania? They will take on the American Dream, Dusty Rhodes, baby, and Sweet Sapphire. Now, you're saying to yourself, wait a minute, Dusty Rhodes is the booker in Jim Crockett Promotions. He's the guy that they brought Akeem out to make fun of, or they brought, now Ted DiBiase has a manager / second named Virgil, which is Dusty Rhodes' real name, Virgil Runnels, right? At the suggestion of Bobby Heenan. So they're doing all this to mock Dusty. Why would Dusty show up in the WWF? Well, here's what happened. At Starrcade 88, one of the main events was the Road Warriors versus Dusty Rhodes and Sting. And they wanted to turn the Road Warriors heel. Road Warriors have been a beloved babyface tag team, but they felt like they've done all they can do with the Road Warriors in terms of being babyfaces, because Arn and Tully, their main rivals, are no longer with the company. Of course, they got fed up with the new management. They left the company and they went to the WWF. They're here in the WWF at this event. Also, the Rock and Roll Express left and went down to Memphis, so they turned the Midnight's babyface. Initially, the Midnights were supposed to feud with Arn and Tully, but Arn and Tully left, so That's when Jim Cornette gets on the horn. He contacts Paul Heyman, who's working. Paul Heyman is working in the AWA with his version of the Midnight Express. Then it's Convy and Randy Rose, which is called the original Midnight Express. So they say, since they're an AWA and they're known on the ESPN network, bring them over to NWA and we'll have a feud with them. And on one WCW Saturday night, they attack Jim Cornette, blooding up his jacket and turning him babyface. But George Scott, the booker in NWA, doesn't like the Midnight Express, and he's against paying managers all that kind of money. So eventually, the original Midnight Express and the new Midnight Express, Bobby. Where am I from? I'm from New York City, uh, David. He's against paying those guys all that type of money. So what does he do? Uh, what ends up happening? The original Midnight Express gimmick versus the new Midnight Express gimmick. Stan Lane has switched. He was used to be a member of the Fantastics with Steve Keirn. The Fabulous Ones. Sorry, with Steve Keirn. But now he's a heel now, and he's with the Midnight Express. But that original Midnight versus New Midnight is dropped, and Jim Cornette is left feuding with the Samoan SWAT team, who Heyman brings in as his new charges. But the point is, the Midnight Express are baby faces. So the Road Warriors have nobody to feud with. They don't have the Horsemen anymore. They don't have the Midnight Express. So they have to turn the Road Warriors heel. So they figure the Road Warriors are so over, the only way to turn them heel is to do something really drastic. So they come up with the idea that they will stab Dusty's eye with one of the spikes from their shoulder pads. And they do that on WCW Saturday Night. Problem is, Ted Turner has just purchased WCW. So WCW is under new management now. And the TBS management doesn't want that much blood, even though Jim Cornette's jacket got all bloodied up when him and the new Midnight Express were attacked by the original Midnight Express on WCW Saturday Night. His jacket got all bloodied up. They don't want a lot of blood on TV. They're against him because of that angle, because of the Jim Cornette angle. They're like, well, we're not putting up with any more blood. And they tell Dusty, who's the booker, they're not doing that, right? So Dusty doesn't listen. And this is part of the reason why the Midnight Express angle didn't work either. Dusty didn't listen, and Dusty gets fired because his eye is all bloodied up, because he figures that's the only way that they can really hype this match coming up at Starrcade 88. And now Dusty's out of a job, so he has to go to the WWF, and he does. He comes in as the Common Man. Basically, a bunch of vignettes of him doing just mundane jobs. He's a pizza man, he's a plumber, he's a mechanic. Dusty Rhodes, the Common Man, baby. Not the American Dream, but the Common Man. And Vince has this idea to put him in polka dots. So we'll be seeing Dusty Rhodes at WrestleMania 6 in the next installment. So that's the story of how Dusty Rhodes is now kicked out of Jim Crockett Promotions, and George Scott is in. So being that George Scott is in, the Midnight Express are out because he doesn't like them. Can't kick out the original, the new Midnight Express, because they're making a lot of money, but he kicks out the original Midnight Express, Dennis Convey and Randy Rhodes, and the angle is shot. So, and what else does George Scott do? With the success of the head-to-head battle between Clash of Champions 1 and WrestleMania 4, most people say that Clash of Champions 1 was better than WrestleMania 4. So WCW decides to do the exact same thing again. This time, though, it's not as successful. It's Ricky Steamboat and Ric Flair in their series of matches, and this is Clash of Champions 6. It's not as successful because George Scott doesn't promote it correctly, because George Scott says, why would we give this? He has an old school mentality. He's like, why would we give this match away for free on? Yeah, Lisa, no class today. Why would we give this match away for free on TV when we could give it when we could make people pay for it in the house show loop? So he promotes it on the house show loop, but he doesn't promote it in Clash of Champions, and it bombs. Nobody watches it, even though it's considered by wrestling fans to be one of the greatest matches ever. Nobody watches it. So if a tree falls in the woods and nobody hears, does the tree really fall? So that's one of the reasons why George Scott and Jim Herd, who is the new head of WCW under Ted Turner, both bomb. And Jim Cornette is having conniption fits because he's put on the creative team alongside Kevin Sullivan, and that's a story with WCW. This new management is causing a mass exodus of WCW talent. Pretty soon, the Road Warriors will leave, and even Ric Flair will leave. But we'll get to that in future episodes. We talk especially about WrestleMania 8, where Flair and the Road Warriors are both on the show. Peace, guys. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you, Sayer, for contributing. Thank you, David, for contributing. And thank you, Lisa, for contributing. And yes, David, I'm from New York. And no, Lisa, there was no class today at SAE. Peace.